Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about one of the strangest, most haunting, and deeply unsettling love stories in Roman history. And yes, I said love story, but you're going to realize pretty quickly that this story has more in common with a psychological horror movie than a candlelit dinner. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's listening in from across the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some background white noise. And let's ease into tonight's journey through ancient Rome. But fair warning, this is not your usual bedtime tale. You're lying in the imperial bedroom of Emperor Nero's palace. You can hear the faint trickle of a fountain in the distance, the clink of goblets in the hall, and somewhere music. Nero loved music. In fact, he thought he was a musician first and an emperor second. But the palace isn't filled with the relaxed sounds of dinner or leisure. There's something off, something ghostly. You overhear whispers his servants are worried. Nero has been talking to shadows. He's been hearing the voice of a woman who's no longer alive. Poppaea Sabina, his beloved empress. And by beloved, we mean she was possibly murdered by the man who claimed to adore her. Let's back up. Nero was the kind of guy history books have trouble describing without using phrases like completely unhinged. Theatrical tyrant. An opera villain in real life. He became emperor at the age of 16. He liked poetry, singing, performing, and eventually lighting parts of his own city on fire, allegedly. Of course, but perhaps most bizarre was the way he handled grief. When Poppaea died, some say because Nero kicked her while she was pregnant, he didn't handle it the way most people handle death. There was no mourning period with solitude and reflection. Instead, Nero decided he couldn't live without her. So he found a boy, a teenage boy who happened to resemble Poppaea. His name was Sporus, and when Nero saw him, he didn't just think, wow, he kind of looks like my late wife. No, he thought, let's make him become her. You shudder in the corner of the room as the emperor's advisors exchange terrified glances. Nero's orders are clear and terrifying. Sporus is to be castrated. The boy doesn't have a choice. His body is altered. His name is changed. His entire identity is rewritten by the emperor's grief-soaked fantasy. And then there's a wedding. You don't believe it until you see it yourself. Nero, in all his ceremonial glory, taking Sporus by the hand in front of guests. He dresses the boy in Poppaea's clothes, parades him through Rome, and calls him my wife. The citizens murmur. The senators pretend it's not happening, and history takes a deep breath, unsure of how to record this moment without accidentally sounding like satire. But it's not satire. It's real. You try to imagine what Sporus felt during all of this. He was young, enslaved, powerless. One day a nameless servant, the next a public empress. Every step he took in those ornate robes was a step further away from who he had once been. And yet, no one around him dared question the emperor. After all, if Nero could kill his own mother, yes, he did that too. Then turning a boy into a ghost bride wasn't really out of character. It's easy to think of ancient Rome as all marble columns and grand speeches. But this story reminds you that power, when combined with unchecked delusion, can twist reality itself. Nero didn't just rewrite history, he rewrote people. You hear the court musicians playing a soft tune as Nero dines. Sporus, now Poppaea in all but name, sits by his side. Silent, dressed in pearls and purple silk. He doesn't speak. He doesn't resist. He survives. Outside, the streets of Rome are buzzing with gossip. People whisper about the boy empress, the ghost marriage, the madness of a man who thinks he can cheat death with scissors and ceremony. But here's the thing. In Nero's mind, he wasn't mad. He was in love. Twisted, brutal love, but love in his own terms. And when you're the emperor, no one dares tell you otherwise. That's where we'll leave things for tonight for now. You stay a little longer in that cold, echoing hallway of Nero's palace. And the more time you spend watching, the clearer it becomes this isn't about love anymore. If it ever was, this is about control, obsession, and the terrifying lengths a powerful man will go to keep the illusion of his world intact. Sporus, the boy at the center of it all, becomes less of a person and more of a living monument to Nero's denial of loss. A replacement, a symbol, a puppet. You begin to notice something else, the silence. Sporus never speaks in the records. There are no diary entries, no recorded protests, no quotes, just the actions of others imposed upon him. Which makes you wonder, if history only writes down the voices of the powerful, how many people like Sporus have we lost to the margins? People who were rewritten, renamed, erased. But let's go back for a moment. Back to when Nero first noticed the boy. The ancient sources say Sporus was very like Poppaea in appearance. But what does that mean? Was he delicate? Was it his eyes? His face? His quiet presence? We'll never know. What we do know is that Nero saw something he wanted to preserve and control. So he took it. The procedure was brutal. Castration in ancient Rome wasn't a safe or clean affair. There were no anesthetics, no sterile tools, no regard for long-term health. It was painful, bloody, and often fatal. Sporus survived, which meant, in Nero's eyes, he was now suitable to become an empress. That's when the performances began. Nero didn't just dress Sporus up privately. He staged grand public ceremonies. The marriage, attended by court officials and guards. The parades, where Sporus walked beside Nero like a proper Roman wife. He was even referred to by the title Sabina, invoking Poppeia's full name. Imagine that for a moment. You are a young teenager, stripped of your identity, mutilated, clothed in silk and jewelry, and forced to smile while your captor plays the role of grieving husband. The crowds cheer nervously, the Senate stays silent, and you just try to survive. It wasn't just one bizarre event, it was a lifestyle. Sporus lived with Nero as a spouse. He ate at imperial banquets, attended public festivals, even traveled with the emperor. Some say Nero forced him to speak in a high voice, like a woman. Others suggest he simply projected Poppeia's presence onto him, filling in the details with imagination and madness. But there were no laws against this. Roman society had its own twisted flexibility when it came to gender and sexuality. Emperors were considered divine. Their whims were often treated as sacred. No matter how disturbing, as long as Nero kept the army happy and the grain flowing into Rome, most people looked the other way. That's not to say people didn't talk. They absolutely did. Nero was mocked in secret, especially by the elite. Some said he had married a boy and played the bride. Others joked that he had made Rome his stage and turned the empire into a farce. But laughter was dangerous. So was protest. The only thing more terrifying than Nero's madness was his power. Still, Nero wasn't content with just one disturbing ceremony. He later went on to marry another man named Pythagoras, this time playing the role of the bride himself. Yes, Nero was the one in the veil, pretending to be a blushing Roman woman. In his world, reality bent to fit whatever part he wanted to play. And Sporus, still there, still dressed as Poppaea, still enduring. You begin to realize that Sporus wasn't chosen because he looked like Poppaea. He was chosen because he couldn't resist. He had no power. He was young, voiceless, and trapped in a palace of gold and nightmare. In a way, Nero's love for Poppaea wasn't a love for her. It was a love for the control he had over her. And when she was gone, he simply recreated that control with a new body. It's easy to feel rage on Sporus's behalf, but harder still is the creeping horror that no one stopped it. No court official, no noble senator, no priest stood up and said, "This is wrong," because the truth is, they were all complicit. When power reaches this level, it silences not just the victim but everyone watching, too. And yet, despite everything, Sporus survived. He outlived Nero. When Nero's reign began to crumble, when the Senate finally declared him a public enemy, and he fled to die by his own hand, Sporus was still there. At his side, some say he even helped Nero prepare for suicide. A grim symmetry, considering how much of his life had been stolen. After Nero's death, you'd hope Sporus might finally find peace, but life had other plans. He was taken in by another man of power, one of Nero's rivals, then passed along again, this time to a general. Each new protector remembered him not as a person, but as Nero's bride. He was a walking legend, a living rumor, a painful relic from a very public trauma. Eventually, when one final Roman general planned to force him on stage as part of a grotesque play mocking Nero's reign, Sporus made his last decision. He chose death over performance. He ended his own life rather than be used once again for someone else's spectacle. And in that one final act, Sporus did something he was never allowed to do before. He chose. But we're not quite done yet. There's more to unpack. And you, dear listener, still have more Roman shadows to explore. You find yourself wondering if Sporus ever had a real name. Not the one Nero gave him, not the one the historians recorded, but the one he might have whispered to himself when no one was listening. Maybe it was something simple, something his mother called him before he was taken as a slave. But that name is gone now, lost in the folds of history, replaced by the name of a man who made him into a ghost of someone else. Sporus wasn't the only person Nero hurt, of course, but what makes Sporus's story so devastating is how long it lasted. It wasn't just a single violent act. It was an entire life of reshaping someone's identity to serve another's fantasy. The castration was only the beginning. What came afterward was a slow, painful performance that Sporus could never escape. And that brings us to a larger question. Was Nero mad? Or was he simply the inevitable product of absolute power? You sit in the marble gardens of the palace, watching the sun go down behind a row of statues, each one carved with the cold, distant gaze of Rome's emperors. None of them look human. They look eternal. And maybe that's part of the problem. When people are treated like gods, they stop seeing others as real. For Nero, Poppaea wasn't a person. She was an ideal, beautiful, submissive, elegant. And when she died, that ideal didn't die with her. Instead, Nero hunted for a vessel. Sporus became the unwilling body that Nero poured his grief, guilt, and obsession into. But was there grief? Or was it guilt wearing the costume of grief? Some historians believe Nero truly loved Poppaea, that her death broke something in him. Others argue it wasn't love at all, but rage at losing control. After all, Nero had a long history of violence toward women. He killed his own mother. He exiled and executed his first wife. Poppaea's death, by that logic, wasn't a tragedy. It was the climax of a pattern. Still, there's something uniquely chilling about what came next. Because forcing a young boy to become a dead empress, that's not just violence. That's artistry twisted into cruelty. It takes imagination to do what Nero did. And that, perhaps, is what makes it so disturbing. You might think Rome was full of emperors like this, but Nero was exceptional. Even for Rome. Sure, Caligula had his horse made a senator. Commodus fought gladiators while dressed like Hercules. But Nero turned his private grief into a public opera and cast a boy into the role of a lifetime. Against his will. And Rome watched. They didn't cheer. Exactly. But they didn't stop him either. That's something we often forget when we talk about tyrants. They don't act alone. There's always an audience. Always a silence that allows the madness to grow louder. Whether it's fear, apathy, or just exhaustion. People look the other way, and by the time they open their eyes, it's too late. You think again about Sporus. Not the Sporus in robes. Not the Sporus at banquets. But the Sporus who maybe sat up late at night, staring at the moon through a palace window. Did he cry? Did he dream? Did he remember who he was? Or did he bury that boy deep down, just to survive one more day? There's a kind of bravery in survival, in waking up each day and going through the motions. Even when your life has been stolen, Sporus didn't get to be a hero. He didn't get to rebel or escape or write his memoirs. But he lived through something almost unimaginable, and that, in itself, is a kind of strength. After Nero's death, Sporus was taken in by a man named Nymphidius Sabinus, a powerful officer in the Praetorian Guard who had his own ambitions for the throne. And guess what? Nymphidius also claimed Sporus as his wife. He even referred to himself as the new Nero. You begin to realize how warped Sporus's reputation had become. He wasn't seen as a person anymore, but a symbol, a trophy, a strange, living echo of a fallen emperor. When Nymphidius was killed, Sporus passed again into the hands of another, this time a Roman general named Vitellius. And here's where the story turns truly grotesque. Vitellius, in an attempt to mock Nero's memory, reportedly planned to force Sporus to appear in a public play. Not a tragedy, not a drama, a comedy, a farce where Sporus would reenact the events of Nero's court, probably including his own abuse before a laughing crowd. You don't need much imagination to see how that would break someone. For Sporus, it was the end. After years of being used, paraded, renamed, and humiliated, he chose to end his life rather than be made into a joke. And that is how history leaves him. Not as a rebel, not as a politician, not even as a tragic hero, just as a boy who was erased. But tonight, you remember him? You sit quietly, letting the shadows grow around you. And in that stillness, you realize that Sporus' story isn't just about Nero. It's about how history chooses who gets to speak, who gets remembered, who becomes a statue, and who gets turned into a footnote. So maybe remembering Sporus, really remembering him, is a kind of resistance, a way to say, this happened, he existed, he suffered, he mattered. Tomorrow, we'll explore more of Nero's unraveling. But tonight, think about the people history tried to forget, and think about how many more Sporuses there were silenced, rewritten, erased but never truly gone. The palace corridors are quieter now. Nero is dead. Sporus is gone. And yet, their story lingers, like a cold draft through an open archway. You walk the marble halls and think about what happened here, not just to Sporus, but to the idea of what power can do to a human life. How one person's will can shape reality for everyone around them, not with laws or armies, but with performance, with costume, with silence. Let's pause here and reflect not on Nero, but on Sporus. You realize that he is perhaps one of the earliest recorded victims of state-sponsored identity erasure. He wasn't just a casualty of power. He was the physical embodiment of someone else's grief, guilt, madness, and imagination. In our modern language, We might call it coercion, abuse, exploitation, but those words don't quite capture the scale. This wasn't a single event, it was a whole life absorbed into someone else's script. And now that we're a few thousand years removed, it's worth asking, why don't more people talk about Sporus? His story is often buried in footnotes, tucked behind Nero's other crimes burning Rome, killing his mother, fiddling while chaos spread. But Sporus's tale is arguably the most haunting of them all, because it's not about war or politics. It's about a single person's dignity, slowly stripped away in front of the world. You sit by the steps of the Roman Forum, imagining Sporus standing there once, maybe at one of Nero's many appearances, dressed in flowing purple robes, a veil draped over his face, walking beside the emperor with the calculated grace of someone who no longer controls his own body. And yet he had to pretend to smile, to obey, to be Poppaea without ever having been asked. It's easy to imagine the crowd's reaction, not outrage, not protest, but a mix of awe, curiosity, and quiet discomfort. Maybe a few people whispered, "He's just a boy," but no one stepped forward, because when you live under an emperor, silence becomes a survival strategy. And this raises another uncomfortable truth. Nero didn't invent this kind of violence. He just gave it a theater. Throughout history, rulers have tried to reshape others in their image physically, emotionally, politically. They destroy names, rewrite identities, assign new roles, and expect applause. Sporus was simply unlucky enough to be close to one of history's most theatrical tyrants, but he was far from the only one who was erased. Even now, you can trace a line from Sporus's story to so many others, people forced into roles they never chose, people rewritten by stronger voices, people forgotten except as footnotes in someone else's narrative. And the most tragic part, these erasures often come wrapped in the language of love. Nero claimed to love Poppaea. He claimed to love Sporus, but his love was consumption. It devoured, reshaped, and finally destroyed. It wasn't about who they were. It was about what they could do for him. So what would Sporus have said if he could have written his story? Would he have described the pain, the loneliness, the absurdity of being forced to play a part in a ghost story? Or would he have said nothing at all, too exhausted from years of performance? That's the thing about being voiceless in history. It's not just that others don't hear you. It's that eventually, you stop trying to speak, and that silence, the one forced upon Sporus, is still echoing. But history has a strange way of circling back. Over time, the stories that were once buried begin to resurface. Scholars start to ask different questions. Artists create plays and novels imagining what Sporus must have felt. Historians, once focused solely on emperors and wars, begin to wonder about the people in the shadows, the wives, the servants, the slaves, the victims. And when they do, they often return to stories like this one. It's uncomfortable, yes, but it's also necessary, because buried within this tale is something deeply human, a reminder that power can twist love into violence, that silence can be more cruel than shouting, and that sometimes the most haunting stories are not about kings but about those they silence. You close your eyes and picture the final days of Sporus. He's older now, tired, living under yet another Roman leader who doesn't see him as a person, but as a symbol. And when that man demands that Sporus appear in a mock play mocking Nero, mocking himself, Sporus finally refuses in the only way left to him. He ends his life. That moment, though tragic, is strangely powerful. It's the only recorded decision Sporus ever makes on his own. And in doing so, he finally steps out of Nero's shadow, not as a wife, not as a symbol, but as a man who chose not to perform anymore. You might be wondering what we're meant to take from all this. After all, it's not the most cheerful bedtime story, but maybe that's okay. Maybe not every bedtime story has to be soft and sweet. Some are sharp, some are sad, some are whispered by the forgotten, waiting to be heard. And by listening, really listening, we give them a second chance to exist, even if just in the quiet moments before sleep. So tonight, as you drift off, let Sporus's name stay with you, not as Nero's bride, not as a curiosity, but as a boy who survived something unimaginable, as a person erased, but never quite lost. Tomorrow, we'll step deeper into the strange empire that made all of this possible. But for now, rest. And remember, even in silence, there are stories worth hearing. The next morning arrives slowly in your imagined walk through ancient Rome. You're still thinking about Sporus, how a single life could become a living symbol, warped by power, forgotten by time. But this isn't just Sporus's story anymore. It's also the story of Rome itself, an empire that prided itself on order and civilization. While quietly normalizing horrors behind marble walls and public spectacle, you find yourself in the Roman Senate. The air smells of dust and dried ink. Senators in pristine white togas argue over taxes, military campaigns, and public games. But no one speaks of Sporus. No one dares mention the boy empress or the emperor who married a eunuch to replace his dead wife. It's all too scandalous, too absurd, too real. And yet everyone knows. They know Nero forced the boy to become Poppaea. They know about the wedding, the veil, the parades. They whisper it in private, snicker in dark corners of bathhouses, and repeat the tale at drunken feasts with dramatic flair. But when it comes to doing anything condemning it, investigating it, preventing it, Rome turns its eyes away. You realize now that silence wasn't just Sporus's burden. It was Rome's default setting. The Senate stayed silent out of fear. The philosophers stayed silent to protect their pensions. The people stayed silent because entertainment and bread came at the cost of protest. And when you stitch all that silence together, it starts to look a lot like complicity. But let's not pretend this was all completely tolerated. There were people who hated Nero deeply. His cruelty, extravagance, and narcissism alienated many, but not out of concern for Sporus or others like him. More often, it was about power, money, or political insult. The people who eventually turned on Nero didn't do so because of his crimes. They did so because he stopped being useful. Still, his obsession with performance gave them plenty of ammunition. You sit down near the theater of Pompey, where Nero once performed. Imagine it. The emperor, dressed in costume, declaiming tragic Greek verse, while soldiers guarded the exits to keep the audience from leaving. It wasn't enough to rule Rome. Nero wanted applause, adoration, an audience that never blinked. And in that way, maybe Sporus wasn't so different from Rome itself, just another character in Nero's fantasy of control. The difference, of course, is that Rome could walk away. Sporus couldn't. Let's talk about gender and power now, because it's impossible to ignore. In ancient Rome, masculinity was tied to dominance over others, over oneself, over the chaos of the world. To be penetrated, in any form, was to be diminished. To be soft, delicate, or emotional was to be mocked. Women, slaves, performers, anyone seen as passive were considered lesser. And yet, here was the emperor of Rome, marrying a eunuch dressed as a woman, or himself dressing as a woman to marry a man. Publicly, repeatedly. You might think this would be revolutionary, that it would challenge Roman norms, but it didn't. Why? Because Nero was emperor, and emperors could do anything. His behavior wasn't seen as a challenge to masculinity, it was seen as evidence of divine madness. An emperor wasn't bound by gender. He created it, changed it, wore it like a costume and discarded it when bored. Nero's power allowed him to break the rules, but it didn't change the rules for anyone else. And that's key. The rules only apply to the powerless. For Sporus, there were no rules to break, only ones to obey. He was thrust into a world where gender wasn't a choice, but a punishment. Where clothing, makeup, gestures weren't tools of self-expression, but shackles designed to make him forget who he was. You sit in a small garden, watching a young boy feed a bird. You wonder what life might have looked like for Sporus if he'd been born outside the palace walls. Would he have lived quietly, grown old, fallen in love, or would he still have been taken, twisted into someone else's vision of beauty, obedience, and loss? And maybe the saddest truth is that we'll never know, because Sporus wasn't the one writing the story. The historians were, and the historians had their own agenda. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, ancient writers who loved scandal, hated emperors, and rarely cared about nuance. To them, Sporus was a freakish curiosity, an example of Nero's madness, a juicy detail to spice up their political commentary. They didn't write about Sporus's feelings. They didn't speculate on his dreams, his fears, his suffering. They only wrote what made the emperor look more deranged. And so, Sporus becomes a ghost, a figure in the background, a dress, a name, a body that isn't allowed to be human. But in between the lines, you see flickers of him. You see it in the silence of the record, so total, so blank, that it practically begs to be questioned. You see it in the repetition of his name, always as an accessory to someone else's story. You see it in that final moment when he chose not to be paraded again, not to play the fool, not to entertain Rome one more time. That was Sporus's final scene, and it was the only one he wrote himself. You think again about identity, how fragile it is, how easily it can be stolen, renamed, replaced. Nero didn't just castrate Sporus physically. He castrated his identity, took away his past, rewrote his future, and reshaped his body to match a dead woman's memory. And somehow, Rome let it happen. But maybe, just maybe, history doesn't have the final word. Because you're here. Now, thinking about him, saying his name, wondering what his real name might have been. And maybe that's something. Maybe remembrance is a kind of rebellion. You begin to understand that the story of Nero and Sporus is more than just a bizarre footnote. It's a mirror, one that reflects the darkest truths of power, how it corrupts love, how it silences victims, and how it builds monuments not to greatness, but to cruelty wrapped in gold leaf. And yet, in the middle of it all, a boy survived longer than anyone thought he would. So tonight, let your last thought not be of Nero, but of Sporus. Not as Poppaea, not as a symbol, but as a human being who endured the unimaginable and whose story still whispers, softly. In the shadows of history, you walk the ruins now. Long after the emperors have turned to dust, the marble steps are cracked, the golden domes are gone, and weeds climb the stones where once the greatest empire in the world declared its will. And still you think of Sporus. It's strange, isn't it? How one nameless boy, dragged into history against his will, can haunt the ruins more than the generals, the senators, the poets. But that's how memory works. It lingers in the absences, in the stories that were almost never told. And here's something else to consider. Sporus was not alone. Rome had many victims like him: enslaved children forced into royal games, women renamed to match a political marriage, artists honored with death when their performance no longer pleased. What made Sporus different was that his suffering became a page in the book. His name survived, barely, because it made Nero look more monstrous. But for every Sporus history recorded, how many others simply vanished? You sit under a cypress tree, letting that thought settle. The weight of forgotten lives, the pain that doesn't leave a scar in the historical record, the performances that ended in silence. And then, your mind wanders as it tends to do when walking through the past, and you ask, why? Why did Nero go that far? Sure, we know he was obsessed. He wanted to replace Poppaea. He wanted to keep the illusion that she still walked beside him. But why turn a boy into her shadow? Why force that shadow to eat, sleep, and breathe in her place? Why marry him? Because Nero was terrified of loss. You can see it clearly now. This wasn't just grief. This was a man trying to cheat death, trying to reverse time, trying to convince himself that he hadn't destroyed the only person he might have loved. Poppaea's death, whether by his own hand or not, left a hole that Nero couldn't fill with mourning. So he filled it with theater, with control, with a human being made into a prop. Sporus was his way of saying, see, she's not really gone. But it wasn't for love. It was for Nero's ego, his shame, his hunger for forgiveness he'd never earned. And what makes it so chilling is that the empire let him. You're beginning to see how Rome worked. It dressed its nightmares in silk. It called abuse honor. It called humiliation tradition. And as long as the games ran on time, as long as the armies conquered new lands, no one cared what happened behind the palace doors. Even the writers who preserved this story, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, they weren't champions of the voiceless. They were gossip merchants with agendas. Their goal wasn't justice for Sporus. It was a juicier headline, a crueler portrait of a mad emperor. And once they'd wrung all the scandal from the story, they moved on. No one asked, what happened to the boy? But now you're asking, so let's trace the arc. We began with Sporus as an enslaved child, likely taken from a province far from Rome. He was probably illiterate, probably separated from his family. Then he was noticed, selected, and mutilated not because of anything he did, but because of what his face reminded the emperor of. From that day forward, he was no longer allowed to be himself. He became Poppaea, not metaphorically, literally. He was dressed in her robes, called by her name, seated beside the emperor at dinners. He was paraded through the streets like a trophy. He was the ghost of a woman brought back by violence. And for a while, he survived that performance. Then Nero fell. Rome rose against him. And still, Sporus was passed along like a cursed relic. Nymphidius Sabinus, who wanted the throne, took Sporus as his bride. Another marriage, another performance, another round of humiliation, whispered behind curtains and bathhouse doors. When Nymphidius was killed, Sporus went to yet another man, Vitellius, the general who would become emperor, briefly. Vitellius didn't marry Sporus. He had another plan, to dress him up and force him on stage for a mock play, reenacting the horrors of Nero's court in front of a laughing crowd. And that was the final straw. Sporus took his own life. We don't know how. We don't know when. Exactly. But we know why. Because sometimes, the only freedom left is the refusal to be mocked one more time. You take a deep breath. It's quiet here now. The wind rustles the olive trees. The birds swoop low over crumbling statues. And the ghosts, if they're listening, don't speak. But you do. You say Sporus' name. And in that moment, you do something no emperor, no senator, no ancient writer ever did. You acknowledge him. Not as a curiosity, not as a tragedy, not as a symbol of Nero's madness, but as a boy, a person, someone who lived, suffered, endured, and made a final choice on his own terms. You don't need to make him a hero. You don't need to give him a speech he never had. You just need to remember he was there, and that's the strange power of stories. Even the ones buried in dust and shadow can rise again. Even the voices silenced for centuries can find an echo if someone is willing to listen. So tonight, as you drift off, let your dreams walk gently through the ruins. Let them stop at the steps of the palace, where a boy once wore the robes of a dead woman. And imagine not what he suffered, but who he might have been. Not Sporus the symbol, but Sporus the soul. As your walk through history continues, you can't help but feel the weight of what lingers after an empire fades. The stones remain, the statues crumble, but it's the untold stories that echo longest. The air feels dense with them unspoken names, half-remembered faces, people who existed only in the margins. And tonight, you're walking alongside one of them. But let's step back and look at the wider picture. Why did no one stop Nero? Why did Rome tolerate not just his cruelty, but his bizarre descent into personal theater, dragging others like Sporus into the madness? You might think it was fear. And yes, fear was a powerful glue in the empire, but it was also something more insidious: normalization. Nero didn't begin by marrying boys or executing family members. He started with small acts, petty cruelty, extravagant spending, exaggerated performances. And each time, the court laughed a little awkwardly and adjusted. Each time, the line between acceptable and unacceptable shifted a few inches, until eventually, the line was a dot. And then, not even that. Rome was a city trained to tolerate excess, as long as it was wrapped in gold. When Nero first introduced Sporus as Poppaea, there may have been gasps, but no riots. The senators grumbled in private. The writers sharpened their pens, but no one stood up, because the palace was dangerous, and power in Rome wasn't something you challenged directly. That's the terrifying genius of empire. It convinces people that silence is safety, that obedience is wisdom, that cruelty is just the cost of order. You pause under an arch, watching the sun melt into the horizon, and think about how often that happens in history. How often someone like Sporus is crushed between the gears of a system built to serve one man's ego, and how often we let those systems run until it's far too late. Let's imagine a moment. One evening in Nero's palace, a grand banquet, musicians playing, meat roasting on golden platters, laughter echoing through the halls, and there, at the head table, Nero, beaming. Beside him, Sporus, veiled, silent, his face painted, his voice never heard. To the outsider, it might even look beautiful. A strange, opulent love story. But if you look just a little closer, the illusion breaks. You see the bruises beneath the fabric. You see the eyes that have stopped blinking. You see a boy trapped in the role of a ghost. And suddenly, all the splendor becomes something else entirely. It becomes horror. Nero loved spectacle more than truth. He wasn't satisfied with power unless it looked theatrical. That's why he performed on stage. That's why he recited poetry before battle. That's why he turned a boy into a bride, because nothing satisfied him more than creating illusions that no one dared challenge. But that obsession with control eventually undid him. You've probably heard about Nero's death. Cornered, abandoned by the Senate, declared an enemy of the state. He fled to a villa outside Rome, accompanied by a few loyal slaves. He was too afraid to take his own life at first, and when the soldiers arrived, he reportedly whispered, "What an artist dies in me," before finally forcing someone else to help him drive a blade into his neck. Even at the end, it was a performance. And Sporus, he was there. That detail, recorded by at least one ancient source, tells you everything. That the boy Nero had stolen, reshaped, and forced into his private fantasy, was present at the emperor's final act, perhaps holding the curtain, perhaps watching silently from the corner. You wonder what he felt. Was it relief? Fear? Emptiness? Did he hope, for a brief moment, that this might be his escape? And in a way, it was, but not freedom, just transfer. After Nero died, Sporus was handed off like a relic. Nymphidius Sabinus made him a bride again. Then Vitellius tried to make him a joke, and then finally he said no. And when Sporus took his own life, he wasn't just rejecting another humiliation. He was rejecting the entire performance. He was tearing off the costume, the script, the mask that had been forced on him since he was a child. And he did it the only way the world gave him, by exiting the stage for good. You can't help but wonder what might have happened if Sporus had lived in a different time. A different empire, a place where his body wasn't seen as a canvas for grief, where his silence wasn't taken for consent, where his suffering wasn't twisted into satire. Would he have become a poet? A teacher? Would he have fallen in love on his own terms? We'll never know. But this story isn't just about the past. It's also about the stories we choose to remember, the people we lift up, the voices we amplify. Nero is in every history book, every list of tyrants, every dramatic retelling of Rome's decline. Sporus, if mentioned at all, is a side note, a curiosity, a freakish fact. But maybe he deserves more. Maybe remembering him, even in whispers, is a form of justice. You walk now through the ruins of the Domus Aurea, the golden house Nero built for himself after the Great Fire. Its walls were once painted with jewels, its ceiling shaped like stars. Now it's dark, cold, hollow, empty, like the illusion finally wore off. But somewhere, beneath the dust, is a faint echo, not of Nero's songs, but of footsteps that weren't supposed to be there. A boy, walking softly, dressed in someone else's clothes, holding someone else's name, waiting for anyone to see him. And now you have. So as you drift into sleep tonight, let your thoughts rest not on emperors or palaces, but on the people the empire tried to erase, on the silences that weren't consent, on the names that were changed but not forgotten. Say his name, just once. Not for Nero, for Sporus. The moon is high over ancient Rome, casting pale silver over broken columns and forgotten streets. You're still walking, slowly now, not through the bustling empire of marble and fire, but through its afterlife, its memory. And in that memory, one boy still walks with you, no longer veiled, no longer silent. Tonight, you stay with Sporus. You begin to realize something else, something important. Sporus' story is not just about cruelty. It's about the ways history processes discomfort, how it packages horror into entertainment, tidies up trauma into a line of text, and smooths over screams into footnotes. It's about how easy it is to become a character in someone else's narrative and how hard it is to reclaim your own. Sporus never got that chance. And that's what makes him different from so many others who suffered in the empire. Most were crushed, quickly killed, discarded, forgotten, but Sporus lived on. And that's what makes his story feel like a slow-motion tragedy. Not just what was done to him, but how long it was done for, and how thoroughly his identity was buried beneath other people's needs. At every step, someone wanted something from him. Nero wanted a wife, a ghost, a symbol of love that never criticized, never aged, never said no. Nymphidius wanted to inherit the madness by marrying Sporus himself. He tried to present himself as Nero's spiritual heir. He didn't want Sporus. He wanted the myth. Vitellius wanted a joke. He saw Sporus not as a person, but as a punchline to a farce, the same way a cruel comedian ridicules the vulnerable for easy laughs. Vitellius planned to humiliate Sporus publicly and violently by forcing him to reenact his own violation in front of a crowd, and the crowd would have laughed. That's the worst part. They would have laughed because, for them, Sporus had already stopped being a human. He was a symbol, a freak, a tragic anecdote. People don't weep for anecdotes. They don't stop the show for a symbol. They only cheer or boo, depending on the performance. You sit on the edge of an ancient fountain, picturing that play never performed, but deeply real. A stage, a costume, a man pretending to be Nero, and Sporus, forced to pretend to be Sporus, pretending to be Poppaea. It becomes a hall of mirrors, each one reflecting a distortion, each one laughing louder. And at the center, the original self disappears. No wonder he ended it. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't surrender. It was the clearest, loudest no Sporus was ever allowed to say, and though it broke your heart, part of you understands it. After all those years of being claimed, renamed, paraded, married, mock death must have looked like the first quiet room he'd ever been offered. Still, you can't help but ask, what if, somehow, he had escaped? What if Sporus had found sanctuary after Nero's death? Maybe among freedmen, or in a remote province, where his story hadn't reached. Could he have disappeared into anonymity and lived a quiet, invisible life? Or would the myth have followed him? Would every town he entered echo with whispers of who he once was? Maybe that was the real tragedy, not just that his name was taken, but that even if he'd survived, it would have never been returned to him. You notice something else now. How much Sporus's life parallels the mechanics of empire itself. Rome didn't just conquer with weapons, it conquered with identity. It renamed cities, replaced gods, rewrote cultures to reflect Roman values. It didn't just kill people, it absorbed them, just like Nero did to Sporus. Dominate, rename, reshape. Sporus became the empire's most intimate metaphor, a person turned monument. And monuments, once they're built, don't get to speak. But let's not forget he wasn't completely erased. His name remains, scattered across the works of ancient chroniclers. Always in passing, always as an aside, but he's there, not forgotten. Not entirely. And that survival, however faint, matters. Because survival is never just about the body. It's about the story. And the fact that you're here, listening, means the story is still alive. And so we begin to pull it back bit by bit from the hands of emperors and historians. We say, no, Sporus wasn't just a symbol. He was a person, a boy, a name stolen, a life bent under the weight of someone else's grief. And finally, a decision, one final, furious act of resistance. There's something sacred in remembering. You wander now to the remains of the palace. No more feasts, no more parades, just shadows and dust. But if you listen closely, maybe you hear footsteps, maybe you hear breath, maybe, in the echo of marble halls, someone like Sporus walks beside you, free at last from costume and role. And maybe, just maybe, your attention, your awareness, is enough to shift something. We don't get to rewrite his story, but we do get to tell it differently, not as Nero's madness, not as an ancient scandal, not as a footnote, but as a warning, a quiet, flickering voice reminding us what happens when we let people be rewritten for the sake of comfort or spectacle, when we flatten identities into metaphors, when we laugh instead of listen. Sporus didn't leave behind poems. No marble bust bears his likeness. No temple holds his ashes. But you don't need those things to matter. You only need someone to remember you rightly. So tonight, you do. And in doing so, you reclaim something ancient, something beautiful, something fragile, a name, a person, a truth. You reach the end of your walk, your eyes heavy, your heart strangely full, and as you lie down to rest, you carry with you one boy's story no longer filtered through the voices of emperors and playwrights. Just Sporus, just a human, finally seen, and that, more than anything, might be the legacy he never got to write. The sun hasn't yet risen over the hills beyond Rome, but you're still awake. You've been walking with Sporus for what feels like hours, or days, or maybe centuries. His story wraps around you like one of those endless Roman cloaks, heavy, lined with gold, and just a little suffocating. But there's something comforting in that weight too, the weight of knowing, the weight of refusing to forget. You lean against the cracked column of what once might have been a library, or maybe a shrine, and wonder, why did no one ever write his version? We have Nero's voice through poets, through propaganda, through mockery. We have the senators' voices, full of scandal and scorn. We even have the voices of later historians, eager to use Sporus's life as a symptom of Rome's moral decline. But Sporus, nothing, not a single line, not a thought, not even a quote. And so, here's the cruel irony. The boy forced to play a role in one of history's loudest dramas is remembered only by his silence. That silence, though, is not empty. It's loaded. It screams if you know how to listen. It's the silence of someone who wasn't allowed to speak not once. The silence of someone who knew his voice wouldn't be believed or welcomed. The silence of someone who had to survive, quietly, while the world turned him into myth. Tonight, that silence becomes your companion. You stop trying to fill it. You let it breathe. And in the stillness, you start to notice how many modern echoes this story has. Because you've seen it before, haven't you? Maybe not with emperors and eunuchs, not with purple robes and imperial feasts, but you've seen powerful people rewrite weaker ones. You've seen stories stolen and renamed. You've seen trauma repackaged as entertainment. You've seen silence mistaken for consent, and suffering flattened into symbolism. Sporus may have lived 2,000 years ago, but his story isn't old. It's painfully current. He was made into someone he wasn't, again and again, by people with power, people with agendas, people with no intention of asking what he wanted. And this isn't limited to Rome. It happens every time a person's identity is erased for convenience. Every time someone's pain is dressed up for spectacle. Every time a victim becomes a meme instead of a human. Every time we ask, what did they do, instead of what was done to them. Sporus's life forces you to ask uncomfortable questions. Would you have spoken up? Would you have defended him? Or would you have laughed along at the play, said nothing at the wedding, looked away when the robe was fastened? Be honest, most of us wouldn't have said a thing, because we're trained to trust the script, to believe the performance, to assume the stage is the truth. And the most dangerous part, that training hasn't changed much, so maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that Nero was evil. We already knew that. Not that Rome was corrupt. We've read the history books. The lesson is this. Stories matter. How we tell them. Who gets to speak. Whose silence we interpret as consent. Whose name we whisper and whose we erase. You don't get to go back and save Sporus. No one does. But you do get to tell his story differently. And that changes everything. Because it means his life wasn't entirely taken. It means that, in some quiet corner of the modern world, a voice has returned to him. Yours. And as you reflect on all this, you start to wonder something else. A new question, a quieter one. What if Sporus had been allowed to speak? Not as Poppaea, not as Nero's bride, not as a symbol of decadence or decline, just as himself. What would he have said? Would he have told you about the moment he was chosen, how it felt to have an emperor's eye land on your face? Not with admiration, but with possession. Would he have described the pain of the surgery? The way his body became a battleground for someone else's fantasy? Would he have told you about the quiet moments sitting alone, dressed in silk, pretending to smile while his own name slipped further from memory? Or maybe he wouldn't talk about the suffering at all. Maybe he'd talk about the sound of the fountains at night, about the texture of fine linen, about how, for a few seconds, on a balcony, under the stars, he forgot who he was supposed to be. You'll never know, and that's the real tragedy. Because in the end, Sporus didn't die with a bang. He died with a whisper, a closing curtain, a refusal to be mocked one last time, and the world moved on. But now, here you are, remembering, speaking, listening. That's no small thing. It's tempting, after so many heavy thoughts, to try to find redemption here, to wrap it all up with a neat bow. But maybe that's just another performance, another mask. Maybe the most honest ending is this. Sporus lived. He was silenced. He was rewritten. He was remembered, but only as someone else's story. And now, at last, we begin to remember him as himself, even if we'll never know who that truly was. You close your eyes. The ruins fade into darkness. The stones go quiet. But one name remains. Whisper it, if only once. Sporus. The name lingers on your lips long after the final syllable has dissolved into the night air. Sporus. A name history nearly crushed under the weight of power and performance. A name born in bondage, reshaped by grief, twisted by empire. And yet here it is, still being spoken, still traveling, softly, through time. You continue walking through the ghost of Rome. Each step echoes with a story. The Colosseum looms in the distance, silent now, though it once roared with the screams of men and beasts. But even in all its blood-soaked grandeur, it feels smaller than Sporus's story, less intimate, less cruel. Because Sporus's tragedy wasn't about death. It was about transformation, about being forced into a role so total, so consuming, that your former self becomes a myth. And tonight, you begin to realize Sporus was not just erased, he was performed. It's the cruelest kind of vanishing, not to be forgotten, but to be remembered as someone you never were. A dead empress, a joke, a symbol, a vessel, never a boy, never a soul. Even the ancient writers, who preserved his name, couldn't quite see him. To them, Sporus was a curiosity, an anecdote, a symptom of Nero's madness, a strange wrinkle in the fabric of Roman history, but never the fabric itself. No one wondered what he feared, or who he loved, or what he missed. Not until now. So let's take a moment to ask the questions they never did. Did Sporus ever laugh? It's hard to imagine his life wrapped in ritual, humiliation, and expectation. But maybe there was a moment. Maybe a servant slipped on a grape. Maybe a musician hit the wrong note during one of Nero's endless performances. Maybe, for 1 second, the curtain cracked and Sporus found something genuinely absurd. Did he have friends? He must have, even in palaces built on fear. Bonds form. A guard who looked the other way. A cook who gave him extra bread. A stable boy who whispered jokes in Latin as they passed in the hall. Those friendships, quiet, fleeting, invisible to history, may have been the only thing that grounded him. And what about beauty? Did he ever choose his own clothes? Was there a color he loved? A fabric that didn't feel like a costume? A moment when he looked in the mirror and saw himself not Poppaea, not Nero's fantasy, but himself? These questions might seem small, but they matter. Because they return Sporus to where he always belonged, not as a metaphor, not as a symbol, but as a person. And people, real people, are made of little details, of preferences and habits and moments of clumsy joy, even in the shadows of an empire. They hold on to themselves in ways the history books can't quite erase. Maybe that's what makes Sporus's story so powerful. Not just the horror, but the possibility. The chance that, even in the depths of performance, some spark of the real him survived. A glance, a memory, a heartbeat that refused to sync with the music of power. And now, centuries later, we're left with the fragments, a name, a role, a few chilling facts. The rest is silence and the strange, sacred task of filling in the gaps not with fantasy, but with compassion. Because Sporus's story isn't just about one boy. It's about the cost of erasure, the violence of performance, the danger of letting power write people into roles they never asked for. You sit beneath an olive tree near the ruins of the Palatine Hill. It's quiet, You can almost hear the footsteps of slaves who once carried water through these gardens. Their stories are gone too, but tonight, at least, you've given one voice back. And it begs the question, how do you tell stories like this? Stories filled with cruelty and silence without repeating the violence. You can't undo the past, but you can tell it differently. You can resist the urge to sensationalize, to gawk, to reduce. You can choose tenderness instead of drama, inquiry instead of assumption, remembrance instead of spectacle. And maybe that's all Sporus ever needed. Not a savior, not a monument, just someone who would have asked, "Are you okay?" instead of "Who are you wearing?" Imagine what might have changed if just one person had done that. One guard, one courtier, one historian, but no one did. And that's why we're here now, trying too late, but not uselessly, to speak the truth with care. You look toward the dawn. The sky is turning pink at the edges. The city begins to hum with life again, its ruins catching light in their cracks. Time continues. Empires rise and fall. But memory stays. And in memory, Sporus is no longer alone. He is no longer a symbol, no longer a freak, no longer a shadow draped in purple. He is a person whose name was spoken again, whose pain was acknowledged, whose story was finally told with the reverence it deserved. And that's what you carry with you now. As the sun lifts above the hills and the ghosts of Rome fade back into stone, not just a name, but a responsibility. To speak carefully, to remember fully, to ask better questions, to see the people behind the performances both then and now. You stand, you stretch, and as you take one final look at the city of emperors, you whisper the name one last time, not because it's tragic, but because it's true. Sporus. The sun is fully up now, and the ghosts retreat quietly, as they always do. But you're still here, still thinking, still walking through the ruins, not just the physical ones scattered across the Palatine, but the ruins inside you left behind by this story. The ruins of certainty, the ruins of comfort. The way you once thought history was just dates and names, and now realize it's also pain and silence. And people like Sporus who should have been remembered for who they were, not for how they were used. You sit on a worn marble bench in what was once an imperial garden, maybe even one that Sporus was forced to walk through, hand in hand with Nero, playing a role he never auditioned for. You imagine the bird song, the rustle of leaves, the scrape of sandals against stone, the whispers of courtiers, the suffocating quiet of pretending to be someone you're not, with no escape in sight. And then you remember something else. It wasn't just Rome that failed Sporus. It was every era that followed. The medieval scribes who copied Tacitus and Suetonius didn't ask who Sporus really was. They passed along the joke, the scandal, the freakish image. The Enlightenment thinkers, obsessed with Rome's decadence, turned Sporus into an example of decline. Victorian historians, those champions of morality, ignored him entirely unless they needed a cautionary tale. Even some modern books reduce him to a footnote in Nero's pathology. No one asked, what did he dream of? What did he lose? Until now, that realization weighs heavy. You start to understand that history is not a neutral mirror. It's a stage. And too often, the stage is built by those who benefit most from the silence of others. Sporus didn't get a curtain call. He didn't get applause. He didn't even get pity. He got recycled past from man to man, from myth to mockery. And yet, somehow, he survived long enough to be remembered. Barely, but enough for you to be here. So maybe that's something. Maybe the smallest traces are still worth everything. You think of all the stories that were never told, the ones that died with their owners, the ones erased by shame, or fear, or censorship, the ones that didn't fit the empire's version of events, the ones that, like Sporus, existed only in someone else's performance, and you begin to feel the tug of responsibility, not the grand, heroic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that says, if you hear a forgotten name, you say it. If you see someone's truth being rewritten, you resist. If you tell a story, you do it with care. And maybe most importantly, you listen for what isn't said, because silence, as you've learned, is not always empty. Sometimes it's filled with everything someone was never allowed to be. You walk further now, into the heart of what used to be the imperial complex. You pass the site of the Domus Transitoria, Nero's first palace before he built the absurdly lavish Domus Aurea, beneath layers of ash and time. Archaeologists have uncovered mosaics and frescoes, half destroyed but still dazzling. And again, you wonder, did Sporus see these walls? Did he touch them? Did he ever walk through these rooms barefoot? In the quiet hours before dawn, trying to remember the sound of his own voice. You like to think he did, that somewhere between the performances and the silence, he found small moments of realness, that he hummed a song when no one was around, that he laughed once, just once, when Nero wasn't looking, that some piece of him survived. Because that's the thing about performance. It takes enormous energy. It's exhausting. And eventually, even the best actors slip. Even Nero, master of spectacle, lost control of his narrative. His final moments bleeding on the floor, terrified, mumbling his last line were not theatrical. They were human, and so was Sporus. Always, even when history refused to see it. You think about how we often look back on ancient Rome with fascination, its glory, its decadence, its brutality, and forget that it was also filled with real people, living real lives. People who didn't know they'd become examples, or metaphors, or curiosities in textbooks. People like Sporus, whose greatest crime was being noticed by the wrong person. And suddenly, your walk through history feels less like a lesson and more like a quiet act of defiance. Because telling Sporus' story gently, tenderly is rebellion. It's a rejection of every cruel laugh, every lazy metaphor, every historian who treated him like a curiosity instead of a person. You are saying, this matters. He matters. And that is enough. You pause one last time before leaving the ruins. You look at a broken statue, headless, eroded, its name long since lost. And you wonder if Sporus would have become a statue if things had gone differently. Maybe even a philosopher, or a poet, or just a quiet man who grew old in a garden he chose. But that wasn't the story Rome let him have. So tonight, you've helped write a different one. Not perfect, not complete, but closer to the truth. A boy who lived, a boy who suffered, a boy who mattered. You breathe in the morning air. The world has changed, but not enough. There are still people being rewritten, still identities being erased, still silences mistaken for consent. But there are also people listening now, people like you who know better and who speak better. And that's where we'll leave it. For now, with a name, a memory, and a promise to pay attention the next time history hands you a performance and calls it truth. Sporus. Always more than a role, always worth remembering. You walk away from the ruins, but not from the story. Because the truth is, some stories follow you home. They sit in the back of your mind as you pour your morning coffee. They wait in the silence between songs. They don't shout, but they never leave. Sporus' story is one of those, and now that you've carried it this far, it doesn't feel like a burden. It feels like a responsibility. It makes you notice things, like how often the past repeats itself, not with emperors and marble, but with power and silence. You see echoes of Sporus in modern headlines, in stories of children forced into roles they didn't choose, in victims whose pain is repackaged as scandal, in people erased while still alive. And you start to understand that Sporus' name isn't just a window into the past, it's a mirror for the present. Think of all the times you've seen someone ridiculed because they didn't fit the role society wanted, because their body, or voice, or gender made someone else uncomfortable, because they reminded someone powerful of something lost or something feared. That's what happened to Sporus. He became a canvas for other people's emotions. Nero looked at him and didn't see a boy. He saw Poppaea. He saw guilt. He saw memory. And then he took that image, carved it into Sporus' flesh, and forced the world to clap for it. It's easy to condemn Nero. What's harder is asking how often we do the same metaphorically. Of course, how often do we assign roles, decide what someone is before they speak, reduce someone to a label, rewrite someone's story because the truth makes us uncomfortable? That's why remembering Sporus matters. Because his life forces us to confront our own performances, the roles we assign, the ones we play, the ones we applaud when we should be questioning. And now that you've walked with him, you see the world a little differently. You begin to notice the language people use, how easily they call others symbols, jokes, or curiosities. You notice how rarely we ask, who were they? Really, instead of what did they represent? Sporus wasn't a symbol of Rome's decay. He was a symbol of something else, something we're only beginning to name. The danger of forgetting someone's humanity, and the cost of not listening when silence is the only thing they're allowed. You think about that final moment in Sporus' life, again. When Vitellius planned the public farce, when Sporus was expected to relive his own trauma for the entertainment of strangers, a parody of pain, a circus made of scars. And Sporus said no, not with a speech, not with a rebellion, but with the most radical act he was allowed. Refusing to be used again, that act quiet, tragic, and final is not something history likes to celebrate. It doesn't fit into neat stories. It doesn't inspire statues, but it should, because in a world that turned him into an echo, Sporus gave himself the last word. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't satisfying, but it was his, and in some strange way, that makes him braver than anyone in Nero's palace. Even now, centuries later, you can feel the weight of that choice. You can feel how much it cost him to carry the silence for so long. and how rare it is for someone in history to reclaim even a sliver of control in a life that wasn't theirs to begin with. But now, something's changed. That silence is breaking. Because of you. Because you listened. Because you stayed. You didn't look away when the story became uncomfortable. You didn't reduce it to spectacle. You didn't treat it like trivia. You walked through it with care. And that's what gives Sporus' story a kind of second life, not as Nero's bride, or Rome's joke, or history's symptom, but as something more honest, more human. And you begin to realize that while history can be cruel, memory can be kind. We don't need to build a statue for Sporus. We just need to say his name without laughing. We need to tell his story without turning it into a footnote. We need to imagine who he might have been, not what he was forced to be. Maybe he would have grown old in peace. Maybe he would have written poetry. Maybe he would have grown herbs in a small garden and taught his neighbors to sing. Maybe, in some version of the world, he was allowed to simply exist. That's the future we owe people like Sporus, not just in memory, but in how we treat the living, how we resist performance when it costs someone their truth, how we create space for people to define themselves. Sporus didn't have that, but maybe others can. And that starts by listening, by refusing to let history be written only by those in power, by remembering the ones who were quiet because they weren't allowed to speak. You leave the ruins behind, but you carry the silence with you. It's not empty. It's full of questions, full of names we haven't heard yet, full of lives waiting to be remembered differently. And as the world wakes up, you know that telling stories like this, not perfect, not complete, but full of compassion, is how we begin to fix what the empire broke. So say it one more time. Sporus, not a symbol, not a bride, just a boy. Who mattered? It's been hours, maybe days in your mind, and yet you're still with him, still with Sporus. You've walked with him through shadowed hallways, through laughter that cut sharper than knives, through silk that chafed like chains. And now, as you move further into the daylight, something strange is happening. The image of Sporus is no longer a ghost, no longer a hollow figure in a history book. He feels real, present, like someone you once knew. That's the power of staying with a story long enough, not for the spectacle, not for the shock, but for the truth underneath it. It becomes more than a tale of ancient cruelty. It becomes a kind of shared memory. But what now? Where does this story take you once the curtain has fallen? You step back into your world, a world that calls itself modern, enlightened, compassionate. But does it see its own Sporuses? Or does it, too, dress its cruelty in robes of civility? Think about the ways we still erase people. Not with blades. Maybe not in literal marble palaces, but in boardrooms, on screens, in laws, in gossip, in silence. Think of the child who's told to act normal, the worker forced to hide their identity to keep a job, the victim whose story is edited for views, the celebrity whose trauma is sold as entertainment, the person denied their own name. It's different in shape, but not in spirit. And maybe that's what Sporus represents now, not a cautionary tale about decadence or madness, but a reminder of how thin the line is between performance and power, between memory and erasure, between being seen and being rewritten. So what do we do with that reminder? You might feel helpless. Sporus' story is so old, so vast, so full of suffering. You can't fix it. You can't save him. You can't go back. But you can do something. You can start noticing the stories around you, the ones being told, and the ones being silenced. You can question the performances we still demand from people, the roles we expect them to play, the boxes we place them in. You can stop reducing people to footnotes. You can speak up when someone else is being overwritten. And most importantly, you can listen. That's what Sporus never got. Not once in all the sources that mention him do we hear his own words. Not a single sentence. Not even a thought attributed to him. But imagine if someone had just asked him, "What do you want to say?" Imagine how different history might have been if one person, just one, had offered him a platform not to perform, but to speak. That opportunity never came for Sporus, but it can come for others. Today, tomorrow, all around us, and you can be the one who creates it. You remember now how Sporus' life was made into theater, how his suffering was turned into spectacle. There's a certain horror in realizing that's still happening on social media, in headlines, in public scandals. We point, we laugh, we share, we move on, but we rarely ask, what did that cost them? Sporus was forced to become someone else's mirror, and when that reflection was no longer needed, he was discarded. That's the pattern. That's what we must break. It starts with seeing people not for how they reflect our fears, our fantasies, or our politics, but for who they actually are. Even if we don't fully understand, even if their truth makes us uncomfortable. Because being uncomfortable is not the enemy. Silencing is. You walk further now, away from the ruins, into a street buzzing with life. It's modern, chaotic, full of distractions. But something from the old world walks with you still. Not a ghost, not a legend, a truth. That a name is sacred, that a life is more than its narrative. That silence can be the loudest kind of scream. And then, for a moment, you pause. You imagine Sporus not in the palace, not in the robes, not beside Nero, but somewhere quiet, somewhere of his own choosing. A garden, a small home, a bench by a stream. He's older, not broken, not bitter, just still. And maybe, just maybe, he's telling someone his story, in his own voice, not to be remembered, not to be honored, just to be heard. And maybe that's the most powerful ending of all. Not justice, not revenge, but dignity. Given freely, offered gently, held with care. That's what this story asks of you, not to fix the past, but to carry it forward with tenderness, to see what others ignored, to hear what was never said, and to keep speaking the names that history tried to bury. Sporus, say it again, not because he was tragic, but because he was real, and because every time you speak his name with compassion, you help ensure that no one like him is ever reduced to a role again. The modern world hums all around you: cars, crowds, notifications blinking on a phone screen, but in your head, you're still there. Still walking the marbled corridors of Nero's Rome. Still watching a boy forced to wear a crown he never asked for. Still hearing a silence no one else seemed to notice. It's strange how stories do that. The good ones stay with you. The hard ones change you. And this one has, not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. Sporus's life didn't unfold in battles or declarations. It wasn't a clash of titans. It was quiet, intimate, a single person crushed under the weight of someone else's fantasy. And in some ways, that makes it more haunting than all the grand tragedies of empire, because you've seen versions of it in your own world. Maybe you've even played a part, not intentionally, not cruelly, but in the way we all do when we accept the stories we're told without question, when we nod along to narratives that erase someone's truth, when we confuse someone's performance for who they really are. Sporus's story holds up a mirror to that. It asks, what roles have we demanded of others? And what roles have we been forced to play? You remember now how Sporus wasn't even his real name. It was probably assigned to him in slavery. It meant seed, a crude euphemism, either ironic or cruel, depending on who gave it to him. Even from the beginning, he wasn't allowed ownership over the most basic part of himself, his name, and yet it's the only one we have. So we say it carefully now, gently, not because it's correct, but because it's all we have. And in this telling, at least, it means something new. It means memory. It means care. It means survival, fragile, imperfect, but real. You picture him one more time, not in the palace, not in performance, but at the edge of a crowd, watching, listening, wondering if anyone sees him for who he is. And this time, someone does. You do. That matters more than you might think. Because we're living in a time when everyone wants to be seen, but so few people are truly known. We tell our stories through filters and fragments, through performances tailored to platforms. But underneath it all, we want what Sporus never got, to be recognized as ourselves, not for our usefulness, not for how well we fit someone's idea of us, but for who we are when no one's watching. That's the story Sporus deserved. Not as Nero's bride, not as a symbol of Rome's decay, just as a person, with a name he chose, with a voice he used freely, with a life defined not by power, but by peace. And maybe that's the future we're still trying to build. One where no one is rewritten. One where no one's pain is paraded for laughs. One where silence is respected but not assumed to mean nothing. You think about that long corridor again, the one you've walked in your mind so many times now. The one where Sporus stood beside Nero, dressed in silk, bowed in posture, but never in soul. And this time, you see something different. You see the moment after. After the ceremony, after the performance, after the empire, you see a place where he's no longer watched, where he's no longer needed to reflect anyone else's story, where his own story begins. And it's quiet, so quiet, but it's his, and that's all that ever mattered. You carry this with you now, into the noise of daily life, into conversations, and news feeds, and passing glances. You carry it in the way you pause before making a joke, in the way you listen when someone tells you who they are, in the way you remember names. You might not change the world, but you will change someone's world. And sometimes, that's enough. That's how memory becomes movement. That's how justice begins, not in courts, but in conversations, in how we tell stories, in whose voices we choose to lift. Sporus may never have had a legacy, but you're building one now, one word at a time, one moment of care at a time. And long after this story fades into the background of your day, you'll find yourself returning to it, Not because it's dramatic, not because it's tragic, but because it's true. And truth stays, even when the marble crumbles, even when the name was never truly his, even when history only left us scraps. So yes, say his name again, Sporus, not to honor the past, but to change the future for every person who is told to be quiet, for every identity rewritten without consent, for every story that was turned into a stage. Sporus is the reminder. We can do better. We must do better. And maybe, just maybe, we already are. The walk is almost over. You've carried this story through the night, past marble ruins and golden domes, through silence and suffering, past the velvet robes and velvet lies. You've passed judgment, past grief, past the moment where Sporus vanished from history and you've brought him back, if only briefly, if only in thought. You didn't just follow a timeline, you followed a heartbeat. Now, as the final light of day creeps over the skyline of a world far removed from Nero's, you find yourself reflecting not just on Sporus's life, but on your own, on the stories we all tell, the masks we wear, the parts we play sometimes willingly, sometimes because we don't know what else is allowed. Sporus didn't choose the role, but how many of us really do? Maybe that's why this story hits harder than expected. Because behind the specifics, the emperors and castrations, the palaces and parades, it's really about the hunger for dignity, about the need to be seen as more than what we represent to others, about a life that never got to be lived on its own terms. And that's where this journey has led you, not to the blood-slick marble of the imperial court, but to something quieter, something more universal, the ache to just be. Sporus couldn't. He wasn't given the chance. He was reshaped, renamed, displayed, and eventually discarded. But somewhere in that silence, somewhere in that broken space between roles and realness, there must have been a flicker of the boy he used to be, the one before Nero, before Poppaea, before the empire turned his body into a puppet and his name into a curse. And in your mind, you return to that flicker. You imagine him as a child, before the palace, before history's fingers closed around his throat. A boy in the countryside, laughing, running, maybe with a friend, maybe alone, maybe with a mother whose face is lost to time. You imagine him climbing trees. You imagine him tired at the end of the day, lying on his back and staring at the stars, wondering what the future might hold. Not a crown, not a wedding veil, just a future. It's cruel. You think that history only remembers him from the moment he was taken. Everything before that, the real life is blank, as if a person doesn't matter until they enter the orbit of power. But we know better now, or at least we should. We know that lives don't begin at the point of trauma. We know that pain doesn't define worth. We know that even the people whose stories were stolen deserve to be imagined whole. And that's what you've done. You haven't just followed Sporus to the grave. You've walked beside him through the parts history never saw. You've sat in the moments between spectacle and silence. You've asked the questions no one in Nero's court ever did. And in doing so, you've given Sporus something the empire never allowed him. You've given him space to exist, to breathe, to be real. And this is where the journey ends, not with a grand finale, not with revenge or righteousness or restoration, but with a quiet moment of presence, a kind of memorial that doesn't need marble, just memory. So you sit with it, the grief, the empathy, the understanding that telling a story like this isn't about solving a mystery. It's about honoring a truth. The truth that some lives are more than the roles they were forced to play. The truth that performance is not consent. The truth that silence, when imposed, is not the same as peace. And perhaps most powerfully, the truth that remembering is itself a kind of resistance. You remember Sporus not as an empress, not as a ghost, not even as a victim. You remember him as a human being caught in the jaws of something vast and cruel and still, somehow, briefly visible in the long shadows of empire. And in that visibility, something like hope begins to stir. Not hope for him his story is over, but hope for those still struggling to write their own. Hope that next time, someone will speak up. Hope that someone will ask the right question. Hope that we'll choose to hear, to see, to resist rewriting people into roles they never wanted. Hope that telling hard stories with gentleness will become more common. Hope that remembering won't be an act of rebellion but a basic part of being human. So this is where we stop. Not at a tomb, not at a theater, but at a whisper. You were more than they let you be. You were more, and we see it now. We say your name, Sporus, not for spectacle, not for shame, but for solidarity, for dignity, for truth. And in doing so, we carry forward the light you were denied, not as a performance, but as a promise. And now, as you settle in for sleep, let your body rest and your mind quiet down. You've walked through one of history's darker corners tonight, not to frighten yourself, but to understand to sit with a truth that isn't simple, to witness a life that wasn't allowed to be whole. Sporus never had the chance to speak his story, but tonight, you listened anyway, and that matters. You didn't turn away when the tale got heavy. You stayed. You honored the silence. You let yourself imagine the boy behind the name, the human behind the history. And in doing so, you gave weight to something that could have remained a forgotten tragedy, another line in a dusty scroll. This isn't just about Rome, or Nero, or even Sporus. It's about the world we continue to build. It's about how we treat those who've been rewritten. It's about whose stories we amplify and whose we ignore. It's about making space for memory, for complexity, for kindness. So let this moment be soft. Let it be full of the kind of quiet that heals instead of erases. Let it remind you that even when a voice is stolen, someone else can choose to listen. Someone like you. And when the world asks you to forget, to laugh, to look away, remember this walk. Remember the quiet dignity of holding space for someone who had none. Now breathe, turn off the noise, close your eyes, and let tonight's story stay with you not as sorrow, but as understanding, because memory is powerful, and you've just kept one alive. Sleep well. You've done something good.